How do you block a fraudulent payment before the PSP ever sees it? That's what pre-auth FRM, fraud and risk management, does in Hyperswitch. So normally, when a payment comes in, Hyperswitch sends the authorization straight to the PSP, whether that's Stripe, Adyen, or WorldPay. But with pre-auth FRM enabled, there's a step in between. Before any of that, Hyperswitch sends the full order context over to Signified, Riskified, or SIFT, the cart, the customer, the billing, and shipping. Signified scores the transaction and hands back a decision in decision.checkpoint.action. If it comes back accept, the authorization goes to the PSP like normal. But if it comes back reject, the transaction is stopped right there, before any PSP call is made. No authorization attempt, no network fees. The PSP never sees it. Hyperswitch blocks fraud in two ways, and they work very differently. The first one is internal, and we covered it last video, the block list. With the block list, you decide exactly which cards to stop. You block a fingerprint, a card bin, or an extended card bin, and Hyperswitch rejects that card before the authorization ever reaches the PSP. The payment just fails with HE03. In this case, there's no scoring and no third-party review. These are rules you set by hand. The second way is external. Instead of you listing out bad cards one by one, a dedicated fraud provider scores every transaction in real time using the full order context: cart, customer, device, billing, shipping. Hyperswitch sends all of that to the provider through an FRM connector, fraud and risk management, gets a decision back, and acts on it. And the provider can take on chargeback liability, which the block list never does. So this video is all about that second way. External fraud providers like Signified, Riskified, and CyberSource Decision Manager. And we'll use Signified as our example. Let's trace one payment through the whole flow start to finish. Step 1. The customer checks out and the Hyperswitch SDK sends the payment to the Hyperswitch backend with a post to payments confirm. At this point, nothing has touched the PSP yet. Step 2. Because this gateway is configured for pre-auth FRM, the backend calls the fraud provider first, before anything else. For Signified, that's a post to V3 orders, events, checkouts. For Riskified, it's API checkout create followed by API decide. Either way, Hyperswitch sends over the full order context and waits for a decision. Now the flow splits, depending on what comes back. First, the accept path, 3A. The fraud provider returns accept, which Hyperswitch records as FRM status legit. And only now does the backend call the PSP. That's step 4, authorize, out to Adyen or Stripe. The PSP authorizes and returns success with a payment ID. The backend marks the payment succeeded, and the SDK shows the customer a completed payment. So the fraud check comes first, the PSP second. Now the decline path, 3B. The fraud provider returns decline, so FRM status comes back fraud. And the backend stops right here. It never calls the PSP at all. The payment status comes back failed with merchant decision rejected, and connector transaction ID is null because there was no PSP transaction to point to. And that null is the proof. On a reject, the processor was never touched, so you pay nothing in authorization or network fees. Okay, here's the plan. First, we set up Signified. We wire it in as the FRM connector and set the flow to pre-auth, so the fraud check runs before the PSP. In FRM configs, that's the flow set to pre for cards on the gateway. Second, we run a clean payment with the Payments API. Signified Sandbox decides based on the customer email, so we'll use the approved test email. The API returns 200 OK, and right up top, the payment status is succeeded on connector Stripe. Now scroll down to the FRM message block. FRM name is Signified, FRM status is legit, and FRM score is the risk number Signified returned. That's the accept. The fraud check passed and the payment went through to the PSP. And once the payment goes through, the whole decision is sitting right here in the dashboard too. Open the payment under Operations, Payments, and expand FRM Details. Right up top, the attempt shows status charged on Stripe, So the card authorized and captured. Now look down at FRM details because there are two connectors in play here, and the dashboard keeps them separate. Payment processor is Stripe. That's the PSP that moved the money. FRM connector is Signified. That's the provider that scored the order. Same payment, two different jobs. FRM. Message reads, Signified approved. That's the approved decision, the same accept we just saw in the API as FRM status legit. And merchant decision is not applicable because nobody had to step in. On a pre-auth accept, there's no manual review, so there's no human override to record. So that's your audit trail. For any payment, you can see which fraud provider ran, what it decided, and whether a human ever touched it. Third, let's run a flagged one to show the other path. It's the same payments call, but now we swap in the declined test email. The API still returns 200 OK, but this time the payment status is failed and amount received is null, so no money moved. Connector still shows Stripe, the gateway it would have routed to, but connector transaction ID is null because the authorized call never happened. Scroll down to FRM message and FRM status is fraud. That's the reject. Hyperswitch stopped the payment before any PSP call at all. And that same payment in the dashboard tells the exact same story. Open it under Operations, Payments, expand FRM details. It's the same panel, so let's just look at what changed. The attempt status is failure now, not charged. Payment processor is still Stripe. FRM connector is still Signified. But FRM message reads, Signified declined now. The reject. The same decision the API gave us as FRM status fraud. And merchant decision is still not applicable. It's an automatic reject. No human needed. So that's the whole loop. Set it up, watch an accept go through in both the API and the dashboard, and watch a reject get stopped before it ever costs you anything. Now, everything we just did was pre-auth. The fraud check runs before the payment is passed to the PSP. But there's a second position called post-auth. We're not going to demo it today, but it matters because it behaves pretty differently. Post-auth is card-only in Hyperswitch, and it's the flow with the richer state machine. Look at the order on the diagram. Here, the PSP authorizes first, and only after that authorization comes back does Hyperswitch call the fraud provider, this time against the authorized transaction plus the order context. So now there are 3 outcomes instead of 2. Accept, the payment goes through. Decline, Hyperswitch voids the authorization it just got. And then a third one that pre-auth doesn't have, review. On review, the payment moves into requires merchant action, which is Hyperswitch's state for held for a human. The decision then happens over on the provider's dashboard, signified or riskified, and comes back to Hyperswitch as a webhook. An approval triggers a capture, a decline triggers a void. Now here's the catch, and this is the part that trips people up. Post-auth manual review only works if the PSP leg is set to manual capture. If that gateway is on automatic capture, the money has already moved by the time the review decision lands, and there's nothing left to hold. So Hyperswitch requires manual capture on any connector you point post-auth review at. Route a reviewed order through an auto-capture only connector, and the hold just gets bypassed, which defeats the whole purpose of the review. So the takeaway between pre and post-auth. Pre-auth stops fraud before the payment is passed to the PSP, and post-auth catches it after, and it can park a suspicious order for a human to look at. So that's the external fraud path in Hyperswitch. Here's the quick recap. You wire in a fraud provider as an FRM connector, and you pick where it runs. Pre-auth runs the check before the PSP, and we saw this live with Signified. An approved transaction came back FRM status legit and went through to the PSP, and a flagged one came back FRM status fraud, failed before any PSP call with connector transaction ID null. Post-auth runs after the authorization. It's card only. It adds that review state that parks a suspicious order and requires merchant action for a human, and it needs the gateway on manual capture. We'll demo that one in its own video. Signified was our example today, but the same connector model covers Riskified or SIFT. So that wraps it up for this video on fraud decisioning with an external provider in Hyperswitch. Thanks for watching. The full docs are at docs.hyperswitch.io, and the architecture write-up is linked in the description. If this was useful, like and subscribe for more.